Hey everybody, today I'm going to be talking to you guys about conventions. Now, conventions are ways of doing things that aren't necessarily specified by the programming language, but they're kind of agreed upon rules that people who are in programming have just kind of agreed that this is the best practice to do. Right? And the reason why we have these conventions is it makes things more readable and it allows other people to work with each other's codes because everything is kind of programmed in the same way. The analog that I give is usually with like writing. Okay, so for instance, when you're writing, we often like start new paragraphs by indenting, or else we also use punctuation and we capitalize names and things like that, right? But those things are actually not really necessary to do. Like I could write like a whole essay and not capitalize any names, not use any punctuation or anything like that. And for the most part, people would be able to read it and understand it. However, if you're coding like that or if you're reading like that, it's really difficult to read, right? So if someone didn't use any punctuation at all, they didn't start any sentences with capital letters, right? Let's say they wrote all in block text, like all shouting, all caps. It's possible to work with that, but it's just a pain, right? And it's the same thing with coding conventions. So I'm going to go over a few of the conventions today, and I'm just going to use this sample code from a previous program that I've written. Just so you guys know, this is the University of Waterloo CCC Junior 5 problem that I'm going to be working with, just because this is an existing code that I have already. So, okay, now the first one, I'll just write them up here, is to one, name variables with meaningful names. Okay, so in my program here, for instance, you can see I have rows and columns, right? Well, this implies, like once you see this, you might not know what the rest of the code means, but you know probably that there's going to be something in rows and columns. So this implies that there's going to be some sort of grid, right? A target indicates something that I'm probably looking for. All right, pathways. So this is a list of different pathways, right? An empty spot, right? That's gonna, like I said, you might not know what any of this is, but this is indicating an empty spot, right? An array XY. This is actually indicating an array's XY value, right? So things like that indicate what the variable is meant to hold. It's really something you should try and avoid is using single letter variable names like A, B, C, D, and just going continuously, especially because later on, computer programs, they very often will have like hundreds of variables. And so if you just give them all random names like ASDF or Bob or things like that, then it makes the code really unreadable. And it's not just for someone else reading the code, but also for you, right? Because then you have to remember what all these different variables are. And that's actually really hard to keep track of, right? It makes your code prone to errors because you can have when you have equations and stuff like that. If you're having equations and it's just like a times s divided by p all divided by q, stuff like that, it's really hard to understand what the person's trying to do, right? But if you actually have like with meaningful variable names, then when you're looking at equations, you can actually tell if the person's doing it right. So please use meaningful variable names. Okay. The second thing is to code with blocks. Okay. Use blocks. Okay. And here, basically what a block is like a paragraph. Okay. So a block, you can see here is like all these separate things. Like, why is there a space here? Right. Well, in here and here, like I don't need that space. I technically don't have to have it at all. Right? But the reason why I have these things grouped like this is because they all do very similar things, right? They're like a paragraph. They do one thing in the code. Okay, so this is about entering the data. This is about populating the array. This is about setting up pathways. This is initializing the pathways, right? This is the actual solution. Okay, so by setting things up into blocks and grouping things, it makes your code again more readable, and it makes it easier to follow what your reasoning is. Okay, along those same lines is use indenting. Okay, so if you notice that my code, and you can see a good example of it here, is I've used indenting. Not everything is just written on one line, right? So the reason that the rule that we use for indenting is that when something is in the scope of something else, then we indent it. Okay, so here we have a do while loop, right? Everything inside here is inside the do while loop, right? And so that's why it's all indented, including this for loop. Now, this for loop has everything also inside of it, and so that's why everything else is further indented. And then this if statement has this for loop in it, and so that's why this for loop is indented, and then this for loop has all this stuff in it, which is why everything else is indented. And then that's if this if statement also has this if statement inside of it, which is why this stuff is indented. And then there's no further indentation because this is the deepest that it goes, right? And as you can see, like the indentation ends here, and you can match up. Now, a convention, just so you know, of actual coding is to put this open bracket up here. Okay, but for beginner coders, I found that it's actually easier to put it here, and that way you can see, like vertically aligned, it matches up a little bit nicer, right? So this one matches up here, right? There's no scope brackets on this if statement because this if statement only includes one line, which is this for loop, right? And this for loop includes everything here. All right, so you should use indenting to indicate scope. It makes things a lot more readable. And sometimes when you have errors, they're very often, especially at the beginning of coding, they're very often scope errors. And so the indenting will imply how you meant for the scope to be. And so if it's not actually like that, that could be, an indicator that there's a problem. Okay, so please use indenting. Okay. Comments. Okay, as you can see, occasionally I put comments in the code, right? And that's just to label different sections. Sometimes I will put a comment somewhere just to indicate what my line of thinking was, or it could be a reminder text for something. So for instance, one time I was writing a code and it was like a pathways finding problem. And I had to assign each direction a number. And so I just arbitrarily assigned up to be 8, down to be 2, 4 to be left, and 6 to be right. And that's because those numbers correspond to the numbers on the keypad, right? So what I did though is I made a comment about that, just indicating which direction was which, so that later on, if I ever came back to the program, I would know what those numbers meant and why I chose it that way. Another times, what you can do is if you've tried something, you can write down a comment about it and say whether it worked or not, and you can say don't know why but this works, or this I tried this already, it doesn't work, and that can be a reminder for you later to not pursue the same line of reasoning because you already know that won't work, right? So one of the problems is also that it's not really a problem, but it's something you need to be aware of, is that when people are coding, very often you're coding in groups, or sometimes you write some code and you might not look at that code for another 6 months to a year. Right, so that's why comments are important, because they allow you to leave messages and hints to yourself about what you were actually doing, so you don't have to actually read through the whole code. And so similarly, if you're following all the conventions, then you don't have to read through all the code and try and decipher what you were trying to do previously. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to say is meaningful project names. All right, so if you look over here in this project, this is called CCC 2020 Junior 5, J5. Okay, now what that means is Canadian Computing Competition 2020 Junior 5. Right, and so it's something that's very reasonable for me to be able to look at and know what it means. Right, you'd be surprised how many people name their projects like A1, right, or something like that. And okay, if you've got 2 projects, that's fine. But later on, when that person has like 50 projects or 100 projects, when you have them all called like A1, C5, D12, right, when you're looking for a project like that, right, then it's very difficult to find like that project. It's literally a needle in a haystack. Right. And for my own students, when students hand in work, if they hand in a workspace and a project is named like Disco Machine or something like that, I just assume that it's not what I'm looking for. Right. So it has to have a project name that is actually related to what we're actually doing. Right. So I'd encourage you guys to give your projects meaningful names. All right. Well, anyways, that's it for now. Those are the basic conventions that you should be following in your coding. So if you haven't been following them, you should actually please follow them. Right? If there are other conventions that you know of that you think people should follow, you should put them into the comments. I really appreciate that. Anyways, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.